Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining in this conversation series. The future is calling us to greatness.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's great to be with you.
Cool. So, since we've got just a little bit of, we've got a bandwidth issue. When I'm listening to you, I'll probably turn off my video, and I'm mentioning this also so the viewers and listeners can know what's up, just to save on bandwidth. And then when I speak, I'll try to remember to come back on the video. But at the start, one of the
Okay.
things I've been asking all my guests is to first share a little bit of your story, like who you are, what are you known for, what are you particularly passionate about, so that our viewers and listeners can really get a sense of who you are if they're not already familiar with you.
Sure. So for the last 9 years, I have been involved in an organization which my partner Lynette Marie Hanthorne and I co-founded, now called Local Food Shift Group, which has been focused on relocalization. When we started 9 years ago, we were very concerned about the peaking of fossil fuel supplies on the planet and its the relationship between all of that to climate change and environmental degradation and so on, and realized that we needed to start working towards the relocalization of our community. And into that process, a couple of years, we realized that the most urgent priority in relocalization was food, that it was essential that our communities begin to learn localizing their food supply as much as possible.
Yes.
So that's really been our focus for the last 7 years, and it's led us into a much deeper understanding of the issues globally that affect us in our local communities, and how we as humans, build intelligent, co-creative, regenerative, healing responses to what's happening in our world today.
Yeah.
So my particular passion, I guess, is understanding what activates individuals around these issues, and what forces give us callings in life, if you will, presents us with missions that are much bigger and much more challenging than we may have ever rationally chosen.
Yeah. Yeah.
But somehow the universe has pointed the fickle finger of fate at us and calls out of getting before into greater levels of engagement.
Yeah. That's great. Actually, I want you to lean a little bit more into this sense of calling and mission, because I think you're right. So many people are sort of awakening to a sense of mission or calling. Anything else do you want to say about that?
Well, I think it's obvious, for those who are looking, that more people perhaps than ever are awakening to a sense of calling or mission in response to the very, very great challenges that we face on the planet today. And to me, this is one of the most encouraging things that's happening on the planet. I mean, this is what Paul Hawken talked about in Blessed Unrest, that these individuals who are being activated at this time represent what he called the planet's immune system kicking in, and that's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't think, though, that it's just a reaction to what's going on, and what I have come to feel and to understand a little bit is that the forces of evolution itself, the evolutionary thrust, if you will, is moving through people today in a more transparent way than perhaps we have ever seen before in the history of the planet. And that's pretty profound. I mean, if indeed that's what's going on, then it's confirmation, certainly, that we as a species, as a planetary civilization, are reaching or are at some sort of evolutionary threshold here. And things can certainly go multiple different directions from here, but we're at an evolutionary crossroads. And it feels to me that I could even say that the angels of evolution are with us during this time. There's a lot at stake on this planet, and so I think we're because of all these different factors, I mean, we're learning a lot about who we are as human beings and as species, and simultaneously, as you have been demonstrating, and lots of other people, starting with Teilhard de Chardin and others, we're learning a lot about evolution, how evolution works, how evolution unfolds, and how we can align ourselves with that evolutionary thrust. One of the things that is apparent to me that most people who are called in these times are not coming from a place of ego or ambition. There's something much deeper at work, and it's sometimes very, very disorienting.
Yes.
and it's especially disorienting when we get in the way of that with our ego or with our ambition. So I think that we're at a time where we're learning what we're beginning to get a sense of is this, I'll call it a spiritual path, of being an evolutionary catalyst, which really means aligning with and cooperating with this evolutionary thrust and learning how to serve that rather than our own will, our own desire.
Yeah.
It's essentially serving the will and the desire of the universe itself.
Yeah. And in a locale, I mean, one of the things that I've deeply appreciated about your work for years is, your focus on, what you and others are calling relocalization and your work with transition towns and, being engaged in the Boulder, Colorado area in a way that is really trying to awaken and unite and solidify people around what are the issues of sustainability, what are the issues, where are we vulnerable, where can we support each other. And so because you've got experience in that, anything that you could say about, I know a number of people have heard about transition towns, but they may not know a lot about that. If you could say a little bit about both your experience and what you see as the promise there and what you see as the challenges there.
Oh, that's a lot. First of all, I would say the place-based issue is really important. We've heard the statement bandied about that all politics is local. Well, in a sense, I think all evolution is local too.
Yes, exactly.
That evolutionary shifts occur at the smallest, most local level, and spread out from there. But they always start somewhere, and with someone in this case, because we're really talking about evolution of consciousness, evolution of culture, evolution of an intelligent species of life. So about the transition movement, well, the transition town movement or transition movement began in about 2006. It was the second kind of global relocalization effort that was developed. The first one was with the Post-Carbon Institute, which Richard Heinberg is now a senior fellow of.
Yeah, I had a great interview with Richard.
Oh, good. Yeah, so he is definitely an evolutionary catalyst.
Yes, absolutely.
Having impact on a lot of people's lives. But the transition movement was founded by Rob Hopkins. The early beginnings were in Kinsale, Ireland, where he was a permaculture teacher at a community college, and he took his work to Totnes, England, a little market town of 8,000 people in southwest England, where he began looking at how that community could organize itself around learning how to meet its most essential needs locally, which is basically how he defines relocalization, or more commonly now, localization. And the transition movement, he had no intention of creating a movement. He just was looking at his own community. But there were many of us, and many people in the UK, and some of us in other parts of the world, that were sort of eavesdropping on what he was doing via the internet. And when it became apparent that he was possibly creating a model for the process of localizing a community, other people began emulating what he was doing, even before he started presenting it as a model. So long story short, it turned into a movement. It became increasingly formalized, and there are now several hundred groups and communities around the world that are attempting in various ways to emulate that model or to evolve that model. And of course, Rob is obviously an evolutionary catalyst himself, and has really touched the lives of many people throughout the world. And many communities have been deeply impacted by the transition movement. And our organization, well, I will say that we got pretty excited about what Rob was creating in Totnes. I went over to the UK and spent some time there, met with him, watched what was going on there. I needed to know if it was real, if the rumors were true, and if the effort was in any way sustainable, because we had seen the previous relocalization movement through Post-Carbon Institute be unsustainable. It was clearly failing. So I got pretty excited and helped bring the transition movement to this country. Our organization was the first officially recognized transition initiative in the U.S., and we created Transition U.S. as well as a national hub for the movement in this country. And now there are, I don't know how many initiatives there are in this country now, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 150. Our organization has, I wouldn't say that we've distanced ourselves from the transition movement in recent years, but we have distinguished ourselves by focusing solely on localizing our food supply. So for a long time, our name was Transition Colorado as an organization, but we've changed to Local Food Shift Group, and partly because every conversation I had with someone new about all this stuff, before I could talk about local food, I had to explain to people what the transition movement was.
Right, exactly.
And I just wanted to get right down to it, Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, that makes total sense because really, I mean, when you talk about transition towns and the larger vision, there's just it can encompass so much that can be overwhelming. And you're right, when it comes down to what we really need to survive, there's just nothing more basic than food. I mean, I absolutely love John Michael Greer in his chapter on food in the Ecotechnic Future. I wish I had it memorized. I don't have a copy of it in front of me right now, but it's just this classic, like first paragraph, that people realize, people forget how important food is, and that other things really don't matter if that's not there. And we're about to get that lesson in horse doctor's doses, he said.
Well, the potential is certainly there for that. We hope that we can build local food systems
Yes.
As an alternative to the global industrialized, corporatized food system quickly enough so that we don't have to come to the realization here that starvation is not just a third world phenomenon.
Yeah.
And if we don't move fairly quickly, we will run into challenges.
Yeah.
Maybe I can bridge a couple of issues here. One is by saying that my observation is that the transition movement in this country has not really taken hold as a movement. It's not cohered as a coherent movement, partly, I think, because it came out of a culture in the UK where community is much more prevalent than it is here. I mean, it really is a community-based model, and to do anything in this country that is community-based is very difficult because the foundations of community in this country have been so completely torn asunder. We're going to have to rebuild them from scratch.
Well, yeah, or in some cases, Connie's been making this point with me lately. My wife, she's been saying that, in some cases it just never existed because in Europe and so much of the world, you've got multiple generations that are able to tell stories and pass on wisdom of how to live with the land and the water and the natural world in a way that doesn't diminish the quality of that for future generations. You've got these stories, this wisdom, these traditions passed on. And here we've had this eternal frontier. You sort of, you make do and you sort of exhaust the land and exhaust the environment, or what we call the environment. And then you sort of move on. And we don't have that multi-generational wisdom. And we have the sort of go west young man mentality. And now, of course, there's no more places to go to. And I think this idea that we're going to terraform Mars or go to some other planet is just it's just collective insanity. It's just crazy. We have to. I mean, I remember Thomas Berry, my great mentor, saying that to put much effort or energy into space travel and colonizing other places in the world before we come into right relationship with the air, the water, the soil, and life of this planet, he called it blasphemy. I thought it was very interesting language.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. Plus, along the way, we virtually obliterated the people, the natives here that we could have learned from.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, Michael, as you look out, I mean, I'm just curious, sort of this big picture, what do you see as, obviously there are, if we get our, shit together quick and put a fair price on carbon and get the whole power of the market in order, we're going to, at least be doing the right thing and doing it hopefully fast enough that we can avoid the worst calamities. But I'm just curious, when you look out 20, 40, 60, 100 years and beyond, how serious or urgent do you see our situation being? Like, what do you imagine that we can expect in our lifetimes, both sort of best case scenario and worst case scenario?
Well, I read a story a couple of years ago about someone who had been a student of Buckminster Fuller, and who, in Bucky's late years before he died, the student asked Bucky, "Bucky, when you look out into the future, what do you see?" And Bucky said, "Unprecedented hardship." And I think something along those lines is pretty close to what we can expect. I think it's pretty clear now that the human response to climate change and other issues on the planet, I mean, it's gone too far for us to prevent much of the worst case. You know, I do not anticipate that we will see near-term extinction for the human species, as quite a number of very intelligent people do. Mm-hmm. I don't think that we'll get there, but I think it'll be close.
Yeah, kind of like almost a species near-death experience.
Exactly. That's what I think we're in for, a hard and rude awakening. We have missed our opportunity to prevent disaster. Now all we can do is learn how to adapt as best we can, and to dig down deep inside ourselves and collectively, and learn what we have to give to the future. You know, what our legacy as a species can and should be. And I think, you know, I've often thought about this. What is it that about the human species that needs to be preserved for the long-term future? And I think that we ought to be talking about all of this. But that conversation, it seems, has not yet quite started. But I think that given what we have learned about climate change in particular, because it's climate change, global warming is becoming the looming storm, you know, that we're already getting tastes of. But I think it will become overwhelming, and because there is essentially a 40-year lag between cause and effect, we still have to experience, you know, the devastation that we've created or planted the seeds for over the last 4 years. And, you know, in that time, we have burned more fossil fuels than in all the previous time of human history. You know, so there is a lot of climate karma in the pipeline, if you will. Yeah. And so I think it's, you know, there are many different projections, you know, from the UN's, IPCC's very conservative estimates to other people like Guy McPherson and the Arctic Methane Group. You see a wide diversity of projections. But when you boil it all down, what I see is that, well, for instance, in food production, global food production capacity is likely to be reduced by 20 to 30% over the next 20 to 30 years.
Yes.
And that's catastrophic.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, that's hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people facing starvation. And that 20 to 30 years is very, very little time to prepare. So it's an all-out emergency. But, you know, as you and I have both experienced in our lives, when you can see an emergency that other people cannot see because it's still somewhere over the horizon, it's not yet fully visible to everyone, it's very difficult to get people to focus on it. Yeah,
exactly. Oh, Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation series with people like you is that more and more people are waking up to the realities of peak oil and peak everything, as Richard Heinberg says, and climate change and species extinction. So many of the things that are related to that, including the growing gap between the rich and the poor, that exacerbates that and causes itself untold suffering and injustice. How do you and Lynette Marie stay inspired? Like, what allows you to continue waking up, to participate in this great work, to do the work that you're doing, and to stay, if not optimistic, at least hopeful enough or inspired enough to contribute your time, your energy, your gifts toward helping to foster some kind of a healthy future, even if we have, as I agree with Bucky Fuller, unprecedented hardship on the horizon. What wakes you up? What inspires the two of you?
Well, I'd say the first thing is that it's the people that we meet who are evolutionary catalysts, who are awakening in what I would call unlikely circumstances. And they're often disoriented, as I mentioned, but something very, very deep and profound is moving them. Mm-hmm. And so I find all of that very encouraging. At the same time, as I also mentioned, we're learning so much about evolution itself.
Mm-hmm.
we haven't had access to this kind of perspective until very, very recently. Mm-hmm. And I think we're just at the beginning of that understanding. So we're that feeling of learning that we're experiencing, which is truly transformational, is part of what keeps us all going, I think, through difficult times. Our perspective on things is just changing so radically. I mean, 100 years ago or so, our best scientific proclamation about reality was that there was but one galaxy in the universe. That was just 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And now, in such a short period of time, we understand that there are now hundreds of millions of galaxies, perhaps even 1 trillion galaxies in the universe. And we're also discovering that this might not even be the only universe. So our perspective is expanding so greatly. So we're just getting enrolled in kindergarten here.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's happening simultaneously with all of that is our understanding of time and time horizons is shifting. So we're learning that life is not just about, even for us individually, life is not just about the 60, 70, 80, or 90 years or so that we get to spend on this planet. Life goes on. Our life continues. And what maybe most inspiring is the wrong word, but most intriguing about many of the evolutionary catalysts who are showing up today is a deep and profound and sometimes very confusing sense that we've gone through this drill before. This is familiar to us. We know something about this process of when a planet or a society or a culture reaches this point where it's hard up against its limits and must make an evolutionary leap or face possible extinction. Now, I think that it's possible that we have actually experienced this kind of process before, whether it's this planet or this lifetime or who knows? But there's something in us that knows what needs to happen. And so we're going through the process of learning how to pay attention to that part of us that knows. And when we get glimpses of that or experiences of that, I mean, that makes all the rest easy to deal with, because we know the core of life from the universe itself that is moving in us. We know that is a part of us in a real experiential way.
Yeah.
And that makes the whole thing worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you should bring that up, because just this morning, earlier today, Connie and I had a conversation about the radical difference. If you think that your self stops at the edge of your skin, what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, then you're going to have a radically different thinking about death and mortality and crisis and challenge than if you know that your self enlarges. That basically there's the what some have called your ego self, or your my skin encapsulated self, but then there's my continental self, that I'm a part of this body of what Connie and I call Nora. What we don't call this continent North America, we personify it as Nora,
right?
And then part of Gaia, and part of the Milky Way, and part of what we call the universe, and again, whether there's multiple universes or whatever, but our sense of self. And if you identify with the evolutionary impulse, if you identify with this billions of years flow of time, matter, energy, and then in consciousness, then there's, at least for me and for both of us, Connie and I, there's not that sense of fear about our impending death, and there is the sense that in some very real sense we have experienced and our ancestors, including our ancient pre-human ancestors, continue to live in us, in our DNA and our energy, and that they have experienced and all the crises of that is common to humanity and common to life, and that in some very real sense, if we can tap into our deepest nature, we might be able to find wisdom and resolve and patience and courage to do the heroic thing, to make sacrifices on behalf of the future, to work together with people of very different belief systems in the service of a common vision, the common vision of helping evolution continue in a healthy way in this solar system, and helping life continue to have the diversity that we know is vital to the health of the body of life, and to at least help some remnant of humanity survive into the future, and that we don't lose the incredible contributions that have been gained over the last 5,000 years or more.
And it may be that survival is not a requirement. I got very interested in the idea of the supernova, and how Brian Swim talks about how a supernova is essentially a star reaching a point in its evolution where it sacrifices itself, implodes and explodes to create elements that make the next level of evolution, more complex elements, possible.
Yes, yeah.
So, a few years ago, there were several of us involved in the transition movement in this country. Spent some time out at Genesis Farm with Sister Miriam McGillis. Spent 3 days, exploring what really needed to happen in the transition movement. And this idea popped up, this question popped up in the conversation, which made most people uncomfortable, which was, are we a species that is attempting to commit suicide? And, of course, there's a lot of evidence for that. But
certainly, I would not say that we're trying to consciously do it, but we may inadvertently be doing it.
Well, yeah. but because I'd been, studying Swim's Powers of the Universe around that time and thinking a lot about the story of Tiamat, the supernova that really gave birth, or at least the story goes, to our own solar system, our own sun, I started thinking, well, maybe, just possibly, the human species is preparing to go supernova. That might be a different take on this. That surviving as we are now may not be the goal. Maybe we are something like a transitional species that gives birth to something much greater in our own conscious sacrifice, if you will. Now, I'm not asserting that that's the truth.
Sure.
But I found that was a useful way to look at the dynamics of our situation.
Yeah.
It helped me to relax in the situation and not worry so much about survival per se.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. There's two things that come to mind as you share that. One of them is that Connie and I have several movies or movie series that we watch just so many times.
Mm-hmm.
They become sort of our mythic, foundation. The Matrix trilogy we love. Obviously, there's we've watched V for Vendetta many times, but our favorite movie, probably of all, is called Super Volcano. It was done by the BBC and the Discovery Channel. In fact, if you just go to the Discovery Channel website, you can order the DVD. It's called Super Volcano, and it's about Yellowstone. And the fact that Yellowstone is one of about a dozen supervolcanoes in the world, and somewhere in the world, roughly every 50 to 100,000 years, a supervolcano goes off. And a supervolcano isn't like a normal volcano; it's like 2,000 or 3,000 Mount St. Heleneses all at once.
Yeah.
And it's pretty cataclysmic. It doesn't necessarily tie to mass extinctions because there's usually a remnant of most species that make it through. But it is, the last time that any supervolcano in the world went off in human history was 72,000 years ago, Toba in Indonesia. And
Yes.
we now know through genetic analysis that they call it the human bottleneck, that there was human genetic diversity, and then 72,000 years ago, because of Toba, it's quite possible that no more than 7,000 or 8,000 human beings survived in the world.
Right.
And then, of course, all the diversity is since then. And America's supervolcano is Yellowstone, and Yellowstone has blown roughly every 600,000 years for the last 2 million years, and it's been 640,000 years since Yellowstone has blown. So we watch this movie in part because whenever we start thinking the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and it's like, we're just shaking our heads, we remind ourselves, Yellowstone could blow, and it just sort of reframes everything and allows us to relax and do the work that we're doing. So that was one thing. But the other thing that what you were just sharing reminded me of is that Connie is one of the world's experts in what's called convergent evolution or parallel evolution, where the same thing emerges over and over and over again. In fact, anybody listening to this conversation can just put "Let there be sight." Connie Barlow, "Let there be sight." And she has these dozens and dozens of examples of convergent evolution. I mean, eyesight emerged over 24 times in different lineages independently. I mean, the universe was going to see itself. No matter how many times you run back, run the tape back and run it out, you're always going to have eyesight. And you're probably going to have some creature that comes to know that it knows. And so Connie sometimes says, not just humorously, that even if we destroy ourselves and humanity goes extinct, her money, if she were a gambling woman, her money would be on raccoons to be the next self-reflexive intelligence. And it was so fascinating because just about 5 or 6 months ago, I was reading on John Michael Greer's blog, the Archdruid Report. he had a post from a couple of years ago on sort of his vision of the next 10 billion years, I think it was. And it was interesting. He thinks that humanity will last at most 1,000,000 years, because most species don't last more than 2-3 million years. And he thinks following us, the next self-reflexive intelligence on Earth, he also said was likely to be raccoons. And then he painted that they wouldn't last more than a few million years. And then he said corvids, crows, would be the third self-reflexive intelligence. And their existential crisis would be when the crows go to the moon and they discover that some Earth species beat them there. But that kind of long-term perspective is emotionally, for many of us at least, it allows me, let me just speak personally, it allows me to sometimes somewhat humorously, but also seriously relax into trusting the process of evolution, trusting the process of emergence, trusting the process of creativity. And that
exactly. What's clear to me is that this evolutionary thrust that we refer to, this arrow of evolution, I mean, it's unstoppable.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as defeat for the forces of evolution. They will prevail, and they may run into roadblocks, but they always find a way. Ultimately. So sight shows up eventually. Self-reflective intelligence shows up eventually, and way beyond that at levels that we can't even imagine. I wanted to share with you a recurring dream that I started having when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old.
Cool.
That has been great cause for reflection over the years. Not that I understand it, but so the scene of the dream is that I am living in an advanced and prosperous society that's essentially built on a very large island, maybe as large as Australia is.
Okay.
And in this society, a very sophisticated technology plays a central role in the economy of that society. There's no poverty, there's no social strife. Everything is peaceful and characterized by order, at least on the surface. But somehow I become aware. I'm an adult in this movie. I become aware that the core technology on which this society depends is very unstable, dangerously unstable, and will quickly become destructive. And I can see that unless we abandon this miraculous technology that we worked so hard to develop, that we risk utter annihilation. And so I set about to warn the leaders of the nation. No one will pay any attention to me. But I instead turn to the people themselves. I speak publicly. I write. I publish. No one is paying attention. It's as if the society is blind as deaf. And what finally happens, realizing that there is nothing I can do to stop what's going to happen, I find myself on the southern shore of this island, calling for people to join me in a small boat that I have waiting to carry us away. And only a few people come, like 4 or 5 people. And at the last second, before everything goes dark, we push this little boat out to sea. And as I look back, the island erupts and sinks beneath the waves, and everything and everybody is completely gone, except for those of us in this little boat.
Damn. And you've had this dream repeatedly throughout your life?
Yeah.
Wow.
And for many years, I felt that I had failed profoundly in this situation, and this really haunted me.
Wow.
And it was too symbolic of what I was experiencing in my life. I could see what a lot of other people couldn't see.
Yeah.
But eventually I started thinking about the other people in that boat. And I started thinking that maybe that wasn't a failure. Maybe I misinterpreted what was happening at the end. Maybe what I was doing was recruiting people.
Wow.
Not just escaping, but recruiting.
Right.
Maybe even I was the one who was being recruited. Yeah. So when I find myself in front of a room full of people these days, I think about the people in the room, and if some of them might have been on that boat.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Well, one of the questions, Michael, that Connie's asked me to ask all my guests in this series is a little bit off the wall, but it's also been fun because I purposely don't tell anybody about it ahead of time. And that is that if you could have either a one-on-one conversation or a dinner party with with any three people in human history. So either a one-on-one, over a cup of coffee or a beer, or a glass of wine or a meal, or a dinner party where all four of you are together over a meal or whatever. Who would those three people be, and why would you choose them?
Wow. Well, one is a person that I wasn't sure existed until just recently, and his name is Cyril James Skidmore, and he wrote a very extraordinary book and published it very quietly on the internet, not through any kind of way that we would usually recognize as publishing, but he made it available quietly on the internet.
Okay.
About 10 years ago, called The Truth. The Universe is a Growing God. And it's the most extraordinary thing that I have read that I knew that another human being wrote. but he's essentially saying perhaps God didn't create this universe. Maybe the universe is where the universe is going is the creation of a fully conscious God, and that we are in the process of creating this God together. And I kind of, I'm not characterizing it very well, but the thought in that gave me a different understanding of spiritual evolution than I had before. So he's definitely one person, Cyril James Skidmore.
Okay, cool.
And I just got a message from him recently that let me know that he actually exists on the planet. I wasn't sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes especially particularly provocative or insightful or radical writings are often written under a pseudonym, and so sometimes
right. It may not be his real name. I've been unable to learn anything about him except what he has written, which is quite extraordinary. The other. Oh gosh, I would say James David Garcia is another one who he is deceased. I never got to meet him. He died several years ago. He wrote a book called Creative Transformation. I'm sorry, it's John David Garcia. He wrote Creative Transformation, which subtitle is A Practical Guide for Maximizing Creativity. Very poorly titled, but it's essentially he created an evolutionary ethic. And he's one of the few evolutionary ethicists that I was ever aware of, and I think it's very unfortunate that his work is virtually unknown. It's been central for my own life, certainly. So I did get to talk to him on the telephone a couple of times, a couple of years before he died, but I never got to meet him, and would love to spend several days with him. He used to offer a week-long workshop up in Oregon, for which he would put you up, no charge, house you, feed you, put you through the workshop. His sole requirement was that you had read his book and understood it.
Well, now that in this conversation, back, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years ago, when Connie and I stayed with you and Lynette Marie, I think you recommended him at that time, and I did explore him a little bit. So this is just coming back to me now.
Yeah. The other person I think would be Arthur M. Young, who wrote a book called The Reflexive Universe, The Evolution of Consciousness, which was published in the 70s. And he was way ahead of his time. He's also deceased. I never got to meet him, but I would like to spend some time with him about updating his book. The model of the evolution of the universe that he presented at that time is quite extraordinary, way ahead of his time, and so we have been working. Lynette Marie and I have been working on updating that and using it as a guide in our own work. So the food localization work that we're doing is our laboratory for the path of being an evolutionary catalyst of the spiritual path of emergence, if you will.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Well, any last things that you'd like to say or share with this community of people around the conversation or around the theme? The past is rooting for us and the future is calling us to greatness. And then how can people learn more? Where should people go to learn more about your work?
Gosh, well, I'm in the process of writing a book now about the working title is The Local Food Shift, How Humanity Will Feed Itself in Uncertain Times. And much of these perspectives will be embedded in that book. I hope that'll be out by the middle of next year. Okay. I wish I had something right at the tip of my tongue to say as a parting shot, but I would just like to suggest that we're at the very beginning of understanding who we are. And yes, it's a very, very difficult and challenging time, but those are the kinds of times when evolutionary breakthroughs always occur.
Yeah.
And those of us who are feeling these deep currents of calling and mission need to honor those inside us and learn how to allow those to be expressed in the world because they represent who we truly are.
Yeah. Amen. Well, Michael, just blessings on you, love and blessings to you and Lynette Marie, and your work, and great to reconnect here. And next time we're out in the Boulder area, I promise we'll get together.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's been great talking with you today.
Cool.